Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we begin our journey into the heart of the untamed West, do me a favor and comment below. Let me know where you're listening from. It's always a pleasure to know how far these stories travel. Tonight, in a town swallowed by dust and despair, a woman stripped of everything is sold like cattle. Alone and forsaken, her future looks grim until a grieving widowed rancher steps out of the shadows with 5 words that alter her destiny forever. This is Eliz's story of loss, resilience, and the fight to rebuild from nothing. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the weathered faces of its inhabitants. It was a town that lived up to half its name. Gulch was real enough, a deep, dusty scar in the landscape. The redemption part, however, was in short supply. It was a place where fortunes were lost quicker than they were made, where justice was often decided by the speed of a man's drawl, and where mercy was a currency scarcer than clean water. At the heart of the town square, a makeshift auction stage had been erected. It was a place of commerce and cruelty, where land, livestock, and the last remnants of failed lives were sold off to the highest bidder. Today, the prize was a woman. Her name was Eliza. She stood on the splintered planks, a ghost in the shimmering heat. Her dress, a tattered calico that had seen far better days, hung from her thin frame, caked with the dust of the trail and the grime of despair. Her once bright auburn hair was a tangled mess, loose strands clinging to a face smudged with dirt and streaked with the memory of tears. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were the color of a stormy sea, vast and deep, and in them dwelled the haunting emptiness of a soul that had witnessed the complete annihilation of its world. Just 2 months prior, she'd had a family. A father with calloused, kind hands who could coax life from the stubborn soil. A mother whose laughter was the melody of their small, happy homestead. A home filled with the scent of baking bread and the warmth of a hearth that never grew cold. Then the fever came, swift and brutal, a thief in the night that stole them both. The bank, with its incan-paper heart, had not waited for her grief to subside. The land was seized, the house shuttered, and Eliza, with no kin and no coin, was cast out. She became another piece of unclaimed property, a debt to be settled. Now, she was chattel. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Croft with a sweat-stained waistcoat and a voice like gravel grinding, gestured toward her with a theatrical flourish. Here we have her, folks. A stray, you might say, but young and with a strong back, I wager. Knows her way around a kitchen, can mend and clean. What am I bid for this useful woman? His words were a physical blow, each one stripping away another layer of her dignity. Useful. He made her sound like a mule or a plow horse. A wave of nausea rolled through her. She locked her knees to keep from collapsing, her gaze fixed on a loose nail on the stage floor, a tiny, insignificant detail in the vast canvas of her humiliation. The crowd was a motley collection of the town's denizens. Weather-beaten ranchers with narrowed, calculating eyes, their gazes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Saloon girls in garish dresses, whispering behind their hands, their painted smiles dripping with scorn. Stern-faced matrons, the self-appointed guardians of the town's morality, who looked at Eliza not with pity, but with a cold and forgiving judgment. To them, her poverty and her presence on this stage were proof of a deep, personal failing, a stain upon womanhood itself. Do I hear $1? Croft boomed, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence. Just $1 to start the bidding. A fine bargain for a lifetime of service. Silence. The only sounds were the buzz of flies and the distant, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, an indifferent heartbeat for a town with no heart. The men shifted their weight, their eyes assessing her worth, not in dollars, but in terms of labor and submission. They saw her not as a person, but as a solution to a problem: a lonely cabin, a motherless child, a household in need of a silent, unpaid servant. Yet, no one spoke. Her tragedy was too fresh, too raw. It clung to her like a shroud, and in a town rife with its own hardships, no one wanted to buy another's misfortune. A rough-looking miner with a beard stained by tobacco juice spat on the ground. Damaged goods, Croft. Look at her. Spirits gone right out of her. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the crowd. Eliza flinched as if struck. The words were true. She felt hollowed out, a mere shell of the girl she had been. The fire that once burned within her, the one that loved to ride bareback across the plains and sing off-key with her mother, had been reduced to a single, faintly glowing ember of survival. She focused on that ember, nurturing it with a quiet, desperate will. "Do not cry," she told herself, her nails digging into her palms. "Do not give them the satisfaction." "Nonsense," Croft blustered, his face reddening. "She's just demure. A fine quality in a woman. Come now, gentlemen. $1. Half a dollar. Then, surely she's worth that." His pleading only deepened her shame. She was being haggled over like a sack of spoiled grain. The sun beat down, and the world began to tilt, the faces in the crowd blurring into a grotesque, leering mask. Her breath hitched. She was going to faint. The final humiliation. It was then that a shadow fell over the front of the stage. The crowd, as if stirred by an unseen current, shifted and parted. A man stood there, his presence alone commanding a silence more profound than the one that had just condemned her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the practical, hard-wearing clothes of a rancher: dusty boots, denims worn thin at the knees, and a dark, collarless shirt. But it was the stillness about him that was most striking. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet confidence that spoke of immense strength, both physical and of character. His face was a landscape of harsh sun and private sorrow. It was a handsome face, but one carved by grief, with lines around his eyes that weren't from laughter. His jaw was firm, his mouth a straight and smiling line beneath a thick, dark mustache. And his eyes, the color of a twilight sky, held a depth of pain that Eliza recognized immediately, for it was a mirror to her own. This was a man who had lost something. Someone. This was Elias Thorne. His name was known throughout the territory. He owned the Black Creek Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that bordered the western edge of the valley. He was a man of power and wealth, yet he lived a life of near total seclusion since his wife, Maria, had been taken by a winter fever 2 years ago. He was a ghost in his own right, a man spoken of in hushed, respectful tones, but rarely seen. His sudden appearance at an event as tawdry as this sent a shockwave of whispers through the crowd. Elias Thorne ignored them all. His gaze was fixed solely on Eliza. He did not look at her with the predatory hunger of the other men, nor with the cold judgment of the women. He looked at her with an unnerving, piercing intensity, as if he were seeing not just the girl on the stage, but the shattered pieces of the life she'd lost. For a long, breathless moment, their eyes met. In his, she saw not pity, but a flicker of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of a grief so profound it reshaped the world. Croft, seeing the wealthiest man in the county, practically salivated. His voice became slick with sycophantic oil. "Mr. Thorne. An honor, sir. A true honor. Looking for some help out at the ranch, are we? This one here, she's..." Thorne raised a single hand, and the auctioneer's words died in his throat. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and resonant, a rumble that carried across the square with an authority that needed no volume. $100. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. $100. It was a fortune. More than enough to buy a prize bull, a small herd of cattle, or even a modest parcel of land. It was an absurd, unthinkable price for a woman with nothing. Whispers erupted. Was he mad? What could he possibly want with her? Croft's eyes bulged. He stammered, "Oh, $100 from Mr. Thorne. Do I hear 105? 101? He was met with stunned silence. No one would dare bid against Elias Thorne, not now. The rancher's expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. He held the crowd captive with his sheer, unyielding presence. "Sold," Croft finally yelled, slamming his gavel down with a crack that made Eliza jump. "Sold to Mr. Elias Thorne for $100. The transaction was complete. She had been bought. A cold dread, colder than any fear she had yet known, washed over her. She was now the property of this silent, sorrowful stranger. What would he expect of her? What would he demand for such a price? Her mind, already a maelstrom of fear and grief, conjured terrifying possibilities. Thorne stepped forward and placed the gold coins on the edge of the stage, the clink of the metal sealing her fate. He didn't look at Croft. He didn't look at the gawking crowd. He looked only at Eliza, and for the first time, a hint of something other than grief touched his features. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a quiet, resolute purpose. He extended a hand to her, his palm calloused and wide. It was not a gesture of ownership, but an invitation. an offer of support to help her down from the platform of her public disgrace. Hesitantly, her body trembling, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, anchoring her in the spinning vortex of her life. As he helped her to the ground, the townsfolk stared, their mouths agape, their minds racing to make sense of what they had just witnessed. They were waiting for an explanation, a justification for this bizarre act of charity or madness. Elias Thorne offered them none. He kept his grip on her hand, a silent shield against the prying eyes, and turned to face the auctioneer and the stunned audience. He stood tall, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun, a silent guardian beside the woman he had just purchased. Then, he spoke again, his voice clear and steady, intended not just for her, but for everyone. The words cut through the dusty air, filled with a meaning no one but he could possibly understand, a meaning that would forever alter the course of Eliz's life. My son awaits you. The world beyond Redemption Gulch was a vast and forgiving canvas painted in shades of ochre, rust, and burnt sienna. As soon as the last hovel of the town disappeared behind them, a profound silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the soft creak of saddle leather. Elias Thorne rode ahead, his back a straight and yielding line against the endless horizon. He had given Eliza the gentler of his two horses, a placid mare with a kind eye, but he had offered no words, no explanation, only a curt nod toward the saddle. The $100 transaction had bought her servitude, it seemed, but not conversation. Eliza rode behind him, a tumult of fear and questions churning within her. Each beat of the horse's hooves was a drumbeat marching her further away from everything she had ever known and deeper into an unknown fate. She studied the man who now owned her. From the back, he was an intimidating figure. The breadth of his shoulders spoke of a life of hard physical labor, and the way he sat in his saddle easy, natural, as if he were born to it, spoke of a mastery over his domain. But what was that domain? What kind of life awaited her at the end of this dusty, silent journey? Her mind, a traitorous thing, conjured the darkest possibilities. The whispers she'd heard in town about Thorne were few, but potent. A hard man, the blacksmith's wife had said, closed himself off since Maria died, another had murmured. They spoke of his wealth with envy and his seclusion with suspicion. What did a rich, reclusive, grieving man want with a purchased woman? The most obvious, most terrifying answer made her stomach clench. She was young, and despite her ragged appearance, she knew some men saw only that. Was she to be a drudge by day and a vessel for his lonely grief by night? The thought sent a tremor of pure ice through her veins. She clutched the saddle horn, her knuckles white, and forced the image from her mind. She had survived so much. She would survive this. The sun climbed higher, becoming a white-hot eye in the cerulean sky. The heat was suffocating. Dust, fine as flour, coated her throat and settled in a gritty layer on her skin. Her small canteen, filled that morning from the town's communal well, was already half empty. She watched as Thorne, without turning, reached for his own canteen. He drank deeply. Then, in a gesture that surprised her, he reined his horse in slightly, allowing her to draw alongside him. He held the canteen out to her. His face was impassive, his eyes focused on the trail ahead. "Drink," he commanded. It wasn't a question or a gentle offer. It was a simple, direct order. Her first instinct was to refuse. Pride, a stubborn, foolish weed, was one of the few things she had left. But the thirst was a fire in her throat. Her lips were cracked, her tongue thick. With a shaky hand, she took the heavy canteen. The water was cool and tasted of metal and leather, the most wonderful taste she could imagine. She drank sparingly, not wanting to seem greedy, and handed it back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He gave a short, sharp nod, and spurred his horse forward again, re-establishing the distance between them. The brief exchange had lasted no more than 20 seconds, but it echoed in the silence. It was not an act of kindness, she told herself. It was practical. He had paid $100 for her. He wouldn't want his investment to collapse from dehydration before she even reached his property. Still, a tiny, reluctant part of her noted that he hadn't had to share his water at all. They rode on, leaving the flat, sun-baked plains and entering a landscape of rising foothills and deep, shadowy canyons. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation. Great, gnarled junipers clung to the rocky slopes, and stands of ponderosa pines sighed in the rising wind. It was beautiful, rugged country, but its raw and tame nature only amplified Eliz's sense of isolation. This was his land. She could feel it. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Her family's homestead could have fit in a single corner of one of these canyons. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, stretching like dark fingers across the trail, Thorne finally slowed his horse. He pointed a gloved finger toward a distant ridgeline. "Black Creek," he said, his first unsolicited words of the journey. Eliza followed his gaze. In the distance, she saw it. Not a house, but a sprawling complex of buildings nestled in a wide, verdant valley. A massive barn, bigger than Redemption's church, stood sentinel beside a web of corrals. A long, low-slung main house with a deep, covered porch sat under the shade of ancient cottonwood trees, a telltale sign of a reliable water source. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. It wasn't just a ranch, it was a kingdom carved out of the wilderness. And it was to be her prison. The final leg of the journey was the steepest. The trail narrowed, winding down into the valley. As they descended, the sounds of the ranch reached them: distant lowing of cattle, the nicker of a horse in a pasture, the sharp, authoritative bark of a dog. These were familiar sounds, sounds from her old life, but here they felt alien, threatening. They rode past a bunkhouse where a few weathered-looking ranch hands stopped their work to stare. Their faces were curious, their eyes lingering on Eliza with undisguised speculation. She lowered her gaze, the heat of shame rising in her cheeks once more. She was the master's new acquisition, a piece of living gossip delivered to their doorstep. Finally, they reined in their horses before the main house. It was even larger up close, built of thick, dark logs and solid river stone. It was a fortress, built to withstand harsh winters and harsher men. But there was a stillness about it, a melancholic quiet that seemed to seep from the very wood. The windows were like vacant eyes, and no one came out to greet the master's return. Thorne swung down from his saddle with a weary grace. He tied the reins to the hitching post, his movements economical and precise. He then turned to her, his expression as unreadable as ever. For a moment, she thought he would simply leave her there, to fend for herself, to figure out this new world on her own. Instead, he walked to her side and looked up. "Give me your hand," he said. His tone was still flat, but the words themselves were an offer of assistance. Trembling from exhaustion and fear, she did as she was told. His hand closed around hers, engulfing it. His grip was strong and calloused, the hand of a man who worked his own land, but there was no cruelty in it. He supported her as she clumsily dismounted, her legs stiff and unsteady from the long hours of riding. For a brief, dizzying moment, she stood before him, his hand still holding hers. He was taller than she'd realized, and his proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the scent of horse, leather, and the clean, pine-scented air of the high country on him. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the silver buckle of his belt, unable to meet his gaze. He released her hand and turned toward the heavy oak door of the house. He paused, his hand on the latch, his back to her. "My son's name is Samuel," he said, his voice low, a hint of something fragile, a pain, or perhaps a warning in its tone. "His mother. He misses her greatly. Be mindful of that." Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside, leaving her alone on the porch, bathed in the dying light of a day that had seen the end of one life and the terrifying and certain beginning of another. The house before her was dark, and from within its depths she heard the faint, hesitant sound of a small child's footsteps. The air inside the Thorne Ranch house was cool and still, thick with the scent of pine polish, old leather, and something else, a faint, lingering aroma of grief. It was a palpable presence, clinging to the heavy furniture and settling in the deep shadows that lay pooled in the corners of the great room, and touched by the fading afternoon light. Eliza stepped across the threshold, and the heavy door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, sealing her inside. The room was vast, dominated by a floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace, its hearth cold and black. A massive table, long enough to seat 20, stood in the center of the room, its surface gleaming but empty. Bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes lined one wall, and the heads of a great elk and a formidable-looking bear stared down with glassy eyes from above the mantelpiece. It was a room built on a grand scale, a testament to wealth and power, but it felt utterly devoid of life. It felt like a museum, a place where life had once happened but was now only a memory. And then she saw him. He stood halfway down the grand staircase that led to the upper floor, a small, solitary figure shrouded in the gloom. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, boy swimming in a man's world. He had his father's dark hair and serious brow, but his eyes were wide and dark with a child's unfiltered sorrow. He clutched a small, carved wooden horse in one hand, its paint worn smooth from countless hours of handling. He was Samuel. Elias Thorne stood beside the great table, his hat now in his hands. He did not look at Eliza, but at his son. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than she had yet heard it, but it was strained and certain. "Samuel," he said, "this is Miss Eliza. She will be staying with us. She will be helping around the house." The boy's gaze shifted to Eliza. It was a heavy, accusatory stare. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in her dusty, ragged dress, her tangled hair, her worn-out boots. He saw not a helper, but an invader, an impostor. His small mouth tightened into a thin, stubborn line, a perfect miniature of his father's. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Eliza's heart went out to him. She knew that look. It was the look of a world shattered, of a loss so immense it stole your voice. She wanted to kneel, to tell him that she understood, that she had lost everything. But the words wouldn't come. She was a stranger here, a purchased commodity. What right did she have to speak of grief? She offered a small, hesitant smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Samuel." The boy's only response was to take a step backward up the stairs, retreating further into the shadows. His grip on the wooden horse tightened. Elias let out a slow, weary sigh. The brief softness was gone, replaced by his usual stoic mask. He turned his attention to Eliza. "Your duties will be simple," he began, his tone once again businesslike, detached. "You will cook the meals. 3 a day. Breakfast at dawn for myself and the hands. A noon meal packed for them. Supper at dusk for myself and the boy. You will keep the house clean. Laundry is on Mondays. Mending as needed. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Sir." The word felt strange and bitter on her tongue. "Good." He gestured toward a hallway leading off the great room. "Your room is down that hall. The last door on the left. It's small, but it's clean." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, a flicker of pain crossing his features as his eyes lingered on a rocking chair sitting empty by the cold fireplace. "The kitchen is through there," he added, pointing to another door. "You'll find what you need. If you require supplies, make a list. I go to town once a month." He did not offer to show her the way. He did not offer her a meal or a moment of rest after her long journey. He had given his instructions. The transaction was complete. Now, the service was to begin. He placed his hat on the table, turned, and walked toward a door at the far end of the room which Eliza guessed led to an office or study. He disappeared inside without a backward glance. She was left alone in the cavernous room with the silent, watchful boy on the stairs. The weight of his stare was immense. It was clear he blamed her for being here, for being alive when his mother was not. She was a disruption to his grief, a foreign object in the sacred space of his memories. Feeling as though 100 pairs of eyes were on her, Eliza picked up her small, pathetic bundle of belongings and walked down the hall Thorne had indicated. The house was even quieter here. The floorboards were swept clean, but a thin layer of dust coated the side tables. She could see rooms with furniture draped in white sheets, ghosts of rooms that were no longer used. This was Maria's house. Every polished surface, every curtain, every silent, empty room screamed her name. Eliza was an intruder in a shrine. Her room was exactly as he described it, small and clean. It contained a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small wooden washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out onto a patch of untended, weed-choked ground. It was more than she'd had in weeks, yet it felt like a cell. She sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She could feel the weight of this family's sorrow as if it were a physical blanket, heavy and suffocating. Thorne had not bought a housekeeper. He had bought a buffer. He had bought someone to stand between him and the daily, painful reminders of his lost cooking, the cleaning, the running of a home that had once been filled with his wife's presence. And he had bought someone to absorb the silent, raging grief of his motherless child. "My son awaits you." The words echoed in her mind, but now they held a new, terrible meaning. The boy was not awaiting a companion or a new mother. He was awaiting a target for his pain, a focal point for the anger he could not direct at the fever that had stolen his world, or the father who was too lost in his own sorrow to comfort him. A wave of despair, so powerful it almost knocked the breath from her lungs, washed over Eliza. What had she done? She had traded a public auction block for a private one. She was trapped in a house of ghosts, owned by a man with a frozen heart, and faced with the impossible task of caring for a child who already hated her. From the great room, she heard the sound of small, running feet on the stairs, followed by the slam of a door on the upper floor. She was truly alone now. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a sharp reminder of her duties. Cook the meals. Her first task in her new life. With a heavy heart, Eliza pushed herself to her feet. She smoothed down her ragged dress and took a deep breath, trying to gather the last, tattered remnants of her strength. She was not the girl who had cried when her father's farm was taken. She was not the girl who had trembled on the auction block. She couldn't afford to be. That girl was gone. In her place was someone else, a survivor. And a survivor's first duty was always the same, to get through the night. She turned and walked toward the promise of a kitchen, ready to face the ghosts. The first weeks at Black Creek Ranch passed in a blur of relentless work and profound silence. Eliza's days were governed by the sun and the ringing of the iron triangle that called the ranch hands to their meals. She rose before dawn, the chill of the house seeping into her bones, and fired up the massive wood-burning stove in the kitchen. She made coffee, fried bacon, and flipped endless stacks of flapjacks, serving the plates to the weathered, silent men who filed in and out of the kitchen, their eyes avoiding hers. They were Thorne's men, and their loyalty was to him. To them, she was a mystery, a whisper from town, and they kept their distance. The silence of the house was her constant companion. After the whirlwind of the morning meal, an almost tomb-like quiet would descend. She would clean, scrub, and dust, moving through the ghost rooms like a specter herself. She learned the geography of Maria Thorne's life. She touched the clothes still hanging in a wardrobe, smelling faintly of lavender. She dusted the silver-backed hairbrush left on a dresser. She found a small and finished piece of embroidery in a sewing basket, a colorful bird with its needle still poised mid-stitch, as if its creator had only just stepped away for a moment. With each task, Eliza felt more like a trespasser, and the weight of the woman she was unintentionally replacing grew heavier. But it was the meals with Elias and Samuel that were the most difficult. They would sit at one end of the cavernous dining table, a vast, polished expanse of wood separating them. Elias would eat with a grim, focused efficiency, his mind seemingly 1,000 miles away, lost on the rangeland with his cattle and his memories. Samuel would push his food around his plate, his small face a mask of stubborn resentment. He refused to look at her, refused to speak to her. If she asked him a question, "Would you like more milk, Samuel?" he would either ignore her completely or turn his gaze to his father. Elias would then answer for him, clipped, "He's fine." Eliza tried to break through the wall of their shared grief. She tried to cook the things her own mother had made, simple, comforting dishes like chicken stew with dumplings or shepherd's pie. She baked a soft, sweet cornbread, hoping the warm, homey smell would soften the hard edges of the house. They ate it all without comment, without a flicker of acknowledgement. Each silent meal felt like a failure, another brick in the wall between them. Her attempts to engage Samuel were met with a chilling, calculated resistance. One afternoon, seeing him listlessly tossing a ball against the side of the barn, she approached him. "That's a good throwing arm you have," she said with a gentle smile. He stopped immediately, let the ball drop to the dust, and turned his back on her, walking away without a word. Another day, she baked an apple pie, taking extra care to crimp the edges of the crust just as her mother had taught her. She cut a generous slice for the boy, setting it on the table with a small dollop of cream. He stared at it for a long moment before deliberately using his fork to push the plate away, sending it skittering across the table. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was as sharp and painful as a slap. Through it all, Elias remained a distant, brooding presence. He was a phantom who appeared for meals and disappeared into his study or out onto the land. Eliza felt his eyes on her sometimes, watching her as she worked, his expression unreadable. But he never offered a word of encouragement or criticism. She was a cog in the machine of his ranch, a function he had paid for. As long as she performed her duties, she was beneath his notice. The turning point came on a hot, blustery afternoon a month into her servitude. A storm was brewing in the mountains, the sky turning a bruised, heavy purple. The wind howled through the canyons, rattling the window panes and kicking up clouds of dust. Eliza was in the kitchen, kneading bread, when she heard a cry from the yard. It was a short, sharp cry of pain, and it was Samuel's voice. Her heart leaped into her throat. Wiping her floury hands on her apron, she rushed outside. Samuel was on the ground near the woodpile, his face pale and twisted in pain. He had been trying to climb the stack of logs, and a loose one had given way. He was clutching his knee, where a long, ugly gash was welling with blood, staining his denim trousers a dark crimson. "Samuel," she cried, rushing to his side. He flinched as she knelt beside him, his ingrained distrust battling with his pain. "Leave me alone," he spat, but his voice trembled, and tears were tracking clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "You're hurt," she said, her voice soft but firm, ignoring his protest. "Let me see." She gently pried his hands away from the wound. It was deep, filled with dirt and splinters from the wood. It would need to be cleaned thoroughly or it would surely fester. All her frustration with the boy, all her feelings of being an outsider, vanished, replaced by a pure, urgent need to help. "We need to get you inside and clean this," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She looped an arm around his small, weary frame. "Can you stand?" He gritted his teeth and, leaning heavily on her, managed to rise to his feet. He was surprisingly light. She half carried, half dragged him into the house and sat him on a chair in the kitchen. His bravado had crumbled, and he was now sobbing quietly, a mixture of pain and fear. For the next 20 minutes, Eliza was a model of calm efficiency. She fetched the basin of warm water, the lye soap, and a bottle of whiskey from Elias's study for cleaning the wound. "This is going to sting," she warned him gently before she began. He squeezed his eyes shut and whimpered, but he did not pull away as she painstakingly washed the gash. Her touch surprisingly gentle as she picked out the splinters with a pair of tweezers she'd held to a flame. She tore a clean strip from an old bedsheet and bandaged the knee with a practiced skill her mother had taught her. When she was finished, she looked at his tear-streaked face. His anger was gone, replaced by a child's exhausted vulnerability. On impulse, she poured him a glass of milk and, from a tin in the pantry, took out a small piece of brown sugar, a rare treat. She placed it in his hand. He looked down at the sugar, then up at her. His dark, tear-filled eyes, so much like his father's, held a new emotion, confusion. He had been hostile and cruel to her, and in return, she had been nothing but kind. He slowly brought the sugar to his lips. "Thank you," he mumbled, the word so quiet she almost missed it. It was the first civil word he had ever spoken to her. A warmth spread through Liz's chest, a fragile, hopeful thing. "You're welcome, Samuel," she said softly. Neither of them knew that Elias Thorne had returned to the house when he'd heard the cry. He had stood in the shadows of the hallway, just outside the kitchen door, for the entire time. He had watched as Eliza ignored his son's initial hostility. He had seen the sure, gentle way her hands worked to clean the wound. He had seen her comfort the boy not with empty platitudes, but with quiet, steady competence. He had watched her give Samuel the piece of sugar, a simple act of maternal kindness that he himself had forgotten how to perform. He saw her, in that moment, not as the purchased help, not as the ghost haunting his wife's kitchen, but as a woman of quiet strength and profound compassion. He saw the way his son looked at her, the hard shell of his grief cracking for the first time. Elias backed away into the shadows of his study before they could see him, a storm of unfamiliar emotions churning within him. He had brought this woman here for a purpose, to fill a void in the mechanics of his home. He had not expected her to begin filling the void in their hearts. A single, tiny seed of trust had been planted in the barren soil of his house. And for the first time in 2 years, Elias Thorne felt a flicker of something other than loss. It was a dangerous, and welcome, and utterly undeniable flicker of hope. The incident with the woodpile marked a subtle but significant shift in the currents of the Black Creek Ranch. A fragile truce had been declared between Eliza and Samuel. The boy no longer met her gaze with outright hostility. He would still go long stretches without speaking, but the silence was less pointed, less aggressive. He began to linger in the kitchen while she cooked, watching her hands as she kneaded dough or peeled potatoes, his presence a quiet, tentative question. Eliza, in turn, learned to give him space, to not press him with questions or forced kindness. She would simply talk, narrating her tasks in a soft voice, telling him about the garden her father used to keep or the way her mother hummed when she churned butter. She never asked for a response, and for a long time, she didn't get one. But he listened. She knew he did. About 2 weeks after Samuel's accident, the pantry was running low. It was time for Elias's monthly supply run to Redemption Gulch. The morning of the trip, he found her in the kitchen as she was writing out her list. "The boy's knee," he said, breaking the morning silence. It was the first time he had acknowledged the event. "It's healing cleanly. You did good work." Eliza was so surprised she nearly dropped her pencil. "Thank you, sir," she murmured, her eyes fixed on her list. He shifted his weight, a sign of uncharacteristic unease. "The wagon will be ready in an hour. You'll come with me." Her head snapped up. "Sir, you know what's needed better than I do," he stated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Be ready." He turned and left before she could respond. A knot of dread tightened in Eliza's stomach. Returning to Redemption Gulch. The thought was terrifying. The town was the site of her ultimate humiliation. To go back there, on the wagon seat next to Elias Thorne, would be to parade herself in front of the very people who had scorned and pitied her. She would be an object of intense speculation, the subject of cruel whispers and sharp, judgmental glances. For a moment, she considered refusing, feigning illness. But the thought died as quickly as it came. She was his property. She did not have the luxury of refusal. An hour later, she sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat of the buckboard wagon as they rumbled down the long track from the ranch. She had done her best with her appearance, washing her face until it shone, and mending the tears in her calico dress. She had even managed to tame her wild auburn hair into a simple, severe braid. It was a pathetic armor, but it was all she had. As they neared the town, her anxiety grew with every turn of the wheels. When the first dusty buildings of Redemption Gulch came into view, her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were clenched into tight fists. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As Elias guided the wagon down the main street toward the Mercantile, heads turned. Conversation stopped. Doors creaked open as people stepped out to get a better look. Eliza kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the weight of their stares like a physical touch. She could hear the whispers starting, a venomous buzz that followed them down the street. "Look, it's Thorne. And he's got her with him. Bought and paid for. Wonder what her duties really are. Shameless, the both of them. His poor wife not even cold to yours." The words were like tiny, poison darts. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She had known this would happen, but the reality was so much worse. Elias reined in the horses in front of the Mercantile and set the brake. He seemed utterly oblivious to the commotion their rival had caused, his face the same stoic mask it always was. He got down and then turned to help her, his expression giving nothing away. As his hands circled her waist to lift her down, she flinched, acutely aware of the prying eyes of the town's self-appointed jury. Inside the store, it was no better. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife and the town's chief gossip, greeted Elias with a syrupy sweet smile that didn't reach her cold, assessing eyes. Her gaze flickered to Eliza, raking over her from head to toe with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Thorne," she cooed. "And you've brought your housekeeper?" She loaded the word with insinuation. "Mrs. Gable," Elias replied, his voice a low rumble. "Miss Eliza has the list of what we need." For the next half hour, Eliza endured a quiet torture. As she moved through the store, gathering flour, sugar, beans, and other necessities, she was acutely aware of the other women in the shop. They were the same matrons who had looked upon her with such scorn at the auction. Now, they whispered behind their hands, their eyes following her every move. They saw her, a bought woman, standing beside the wealthiest man in the county, and their minds filled in the sordid details. Her presence with him was not proof of her salvation, but confirmation of her fallen state. She kept her head held high, her voice steady as she read from her list, but inside, she was crumbling. The fragile sense of peace she had begun to find at Black Creek was being systematically dismantled by the cruel whispers of this town. The ride back to the ranch was as silent as the ride in, but the silence was different. It was no longer empty, it was filled with Eliz's turmoil. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry. Not now, not in front of him. They were nearly back to the foothills when Elias suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt in the shade of a tall ponderosa pine. He sat for a long moment, staring at the horizon, his hands resting on the reins. Eliza waited, her heart pounding, certain he was about to scold her for some unknown transgression. "What they say," he began, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual hard edge. "The whispers. You hear them." It was a statement, not a question. Eliza swallowed hard. "It's of no consequence, sir." He turned his head then, and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time that day. His twilight eyes were clear and direct. "Pay them no mind," he said, his voice low and firm. "Their words are dust. They know nothing of you. They know nothing of me." The simple words, spoken with such quiet conviction, struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had heard. He had understood. He wasn't oblivious. He was dismissive. He lived in a world of his own making, a world where the petty judgments of others had no power. And for a moment, he had invited her into that world. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of friendship. It was a simple, profound statement of alliance. US against them. A bond forged in the crucible of public opinion. She started, but the words caught in her throat. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She angrily swiped it away. He watched her for another moment, then turned his attention back to the trail. He flicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. The rest of the ride passed in that same, charged silence. But something had fundamentally changed. Eliza still felt the sting of the town's gossip, but it was blunted now, shielded by the unexpected armor of his words. Their words are dust. She had come to Redemption Gulch that morning as Elias Thorne's purchased woman. She was returning to Black Creek as something more. She didn't have a name for it yet, but she knew it was real. And as she looked at the strong, silent man beside her, she realized that the walls around his heart, and her own, were perhaps not as impenetrable as they had once seemed. In the weeks that followed the trip to town, a quiet rhythm established itself at Black Creek. The fragile truce with Samuel was slowly, cautiously blossoming into something akin to companionship. He no longer just watched her in the kitchen. He began to help. He would carry in firewood without being asked or meticulously polish the silverware, his small face set in a look of intense concentration. They worked in comfortable silence, their shared tasks a language all their own. But the house, for all its growing familiarity, still felt like Maria's. It was her kitchen, her dining room, her rocking chair that sat empty by the hearth. Eliza was a steward, not a master. She needed a space that was hers, a place where she could cultivate something from nothing and watch it grow. Her eyes fell upon the neglected patch of ground behind the house, the one she could see from her bedroom window. It was choked with weeds and littered with stones, but it got good sun and was close to the well. It had been a garden once. She could see the faint outlines of old planting rows. Perhaps it had even been Maria's. The thought gave her pause, but only for a moment. A garden left to weeds was a sadder memorial than one brought back to life. She found a rusty spade and a hoe in the barn. The work was back-breaking. The soil was dry and compacted, and for the first few days, her palms blistered and her muscles screamed in protest. But with every weed she pulled, with every stone she tossed aside, she felt a sense of ownership, of reclamation. This small patch of earth was a reflection of herself, neglected, abandoned, but with the potential for life still buried beneath the surface. Samuel watched her from a distance at first, his curiosity warring with his caution. He saw her toil under the hot sun, her face smudged with dirt, her braid coming loose. She never asked for his help. She simply worked, her movements steady and determined. One afternoon, as she was breaking up a particularly stubborn clod of earth, he approached, holding something out to her in his cupped hands. It was a fat, wriggling earthworm. "They're good for the soil," he said, his first voluntary statement to her about anything other than a request for food. "My mother said they make it breathe." Eliza stopped her work and smiled, a genuine and forced smile that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Your mother was very wise," she said. "Will you help me find some more?" It was the beginning. Samuel became her shadow in the garden. He was a tireless hunter of worms and a fierce defender of the tender seedlings against grasshoppers. He helped her carry water from the well, his small buckets sloshing, his face a picture of solemn importance. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. They spoke the language of the land. They communicated through the shared work of their hands, the satisfaction of a straightly dug furrow, the shared hope contained in a tiny seed. Eliza sent away for seeds with a traveling peddler, using a few coins she had carefully saved from the money the ranch cook allowed her. She planted what she knew of sturdy beans, Brazilian squash, hardy potatoes, and rows of bright, cheerful sunflowers, just because her own mother had loved them. Elias observed this transformation from afar. He would come back from a long day on the range and see them there, two figures so tall and slender, one small and sturdy bent over the soil in the golden light of dusk. He saw the weeds disappear, replaced by neat, ordered rows. He saw the first green shoots push their way through the dark earth. He saw his son. He saw the boy's shoulders lose some of their slump. He heard, for the first time in 2 years, the sound of Samuel's laughter as Eliza playfully splashed him with water from the well. He saw life returning not just to that forgotten patch of ground, but to the boy he had been powerless to reach. One evening, he walked out to the garden. Eliza and Samuel were finishing their watering for the day. Eliza looked up, startled by his presence. She was so used to him keeping his distance. He didn't look at her, but at the neat rows of burgeoning plants. He knelt and touched the leaf of a young squash plant, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "My wife," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "Maria tried a garden here. The soil is hard. The sun is harsh." She struggled. Eliza's heart sank. She had been intruding, desecrating a memory. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. "I can stop." He looked up at her then, and his expression was one she had never seen before. The hard mask was gone, replaced by a raw and guarded sorrow, but it was mingled with something else, a quiet wonder. "No," he said. "Don't stop. You've brought it back to life." He stood and looked from the thriving garden to his son, whose face was glowing with pride. He saw the easy companionship between the woman he had bought and the boy he had sired. He was seeing Eliza not as a function, not as a housekeeper or a replacement, but as a force of nature in her own right. A quiet, patient, relentless force of healing. He gave a curt nod, a gesture that encompassed the garden, the boy, and her. Then he turned and walked back to the house, leaving Eliza standing amongst her sunflowers, the setting sun turning her auburn hair to flame. She watched him go, a single, powerful realization dawning on her. She had planted more than seeds in this soil. She had planted roots. The garden became the heart of the homestead. As the corn grew tall and the squash vines snaked across the rich soil, so too did the bond between Eliza and Samuel. He was her constant companion, his boyish chatter filling the silence that had once defined her days. He told her the names of the birds that visited the sunflowers and showed her the secret trails the jackrabbits used. In return, she told him stories her father had told her, tales of cunning coyotes and foolish bears, and she taught him the constellations her mother had shown her in the vast, velvet skies. This newfound peace, however, was a fragile thing in a land that was never truly tame. The first sign of trouble came not with a bang, but with the grim set of Elias Thorne's jaw. He returned from a multi-day cattle count with his foreman, his face etched with a familiar, cold fury Eliza hadn't seen in months. "Rustlers," he announced that evening at the dinner table, the word dropping like a stone into the quiet comfort of the room. "At least 30 head are missing from the north pasture. The tracks are shod horses, not Indians. They're bold." A chill went through Eliza. The ranch, which had become her sanctuary, suddenly felt vulnerable. The vast, open land that had seemed so beautiful now felt menacing, full of unseen threats hiding in its shadowy canyons. Samuel looked from his father's face to Eliza's, his own small face clouded with worry. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the ranch changed. Attention coiled in the air. The easygoing camaraderie of the ranch hands was replaced by a grim, watchful vigilance. Men rode the perimeter of the vast property in armed pairs, their rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. Elias was gone from sunup to sundown, and sometimes long after. He grew leaner, harder, the lines around his eyes deepening. The silence returned to him, but it was a different silence now, not of grief, but of a predator hunting its prey. Eliza was left in charge of the homestead, a responsibility she did not take lightly. She felt a fierce, primal need to protect the small world she had so carefully rebuilt. One night, she was woken from a light sleep by the frantic barking of the ranch dogs. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Samuel was asleep in his room, and Elias and most of the hands were camped out miles away, trying to track the thieves. Slipping out of bed, she pulled on her dress and crept into the main room. The moonlight streaming through the windows cast long, eerie shadows. The barking outside grew more intense. Her eyes fell upon the heavy shotgun Elias kept on a rack above the fireplace. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she had watched her father clean his often enough to know how it worked. Her hands trembling, she lifted the heavy weapon down. It felt cold and alien in her grasp. She checked it as she had seen her father do. It was loaded. With the shotgun held tight against her shoulder, she moved to the window, peering out into the moon-drenched yard. She saw them. Two shadowy figures on horseback at the edge of the cottonwood grove, just beyond the light of the house. They were watching, observing. They were not making a move on the house, but their presence was a violation, a clear and deliberate message. We can get this close whenever we want. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, but it was immediately followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated anger. This was her home. That was Samuel's home. She would not let it be threatened. She raised the shotgun, its long barrel shaking slightly, and pointed it toward the shadows. She wouldn't fire unless she had to, but the weight of the gun in her hands was a comfort, a solid piece of defiance against the darkness. After a long, tense moment, the figures wheeled their horses around and melted back into the night. When Elias returned the next day, weary and empty-handed, she told him what had happened. He listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. He looked at the shotgun, now back in its place over the fireplace, and then back at her. He said nothing, but his gaze held a new, profound respect. He saw that her strength was not just in her gentleness, not just in her ability to nurture life from the hard soil. She had a core of iron, a will to protect what was hers. That night, a storm rolled in, the one that had been threatening for days. The wind howled and the rain came down in sheets, turning the ranch yard into a sea of mud. As the storm raged outside, a different kind of storm was brewing at Elias. His frustration at being unable to catch the rustlers, coupled with the knowledge that they had been so close to his home, to his son, had brought his anger to a boiling point. He sat at the great table, staring into a cup of coffee, his knuckles white. Eliza found him there, a solitary, brooding figure in the lamplight. "They're not just stealing cattle," she said quietly, coming to stand near the table. He looked up, his eyes dark and stormy as the night outside. "What do you mean?" "Stealing cattle is one thing," she reasoned, her voice steady. "Coming to the house, letting themselves be seen. That's another. That's a challenge. They're testing you. They want you to chase them, to spread your men thin. I think the real prize isn't in the north pasture. I think it's here." He stared at her, the cogs turning in his sharp mind. He had been so focused on the insult, on the theft of his property, that he had been thinking like a rancher. She was thinking like a protector. She saw the threat not to his livelihood, but to their lives. And he realized, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that she was right. The threat wasn't miles away in the dark. It was coming for them. The rustlers' true intentions were revealed 3 nights later. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky wiped clean and studded with a million cold, glittering stars. A deceptive peace had settled over the valley. Elias, acting on Eliz's intuition, had kept his men close to the homestead, a decision that would prove to be the difference between loss and utter devastation. The attack came just before midnight. It began not with a gunshot, but with a sudden and natural red glow against the dark line of the hills. A fire, a massive grass fire, set upwind from the main house, designed to draw every hand on the ranch away from the central buildings. It's a diversion, Elias roared, pulling on his boots. They're after the horses. Half of you, go with Jake to the fire, try to turn it back. The rest of you, with me to the barn. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, dogs barked, and the terrifying, hungry crackle of the approaching flames grew louder. Eliza's first thought was Samuel. She ran to his room and found him sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide with fear. Get your boots on, she commanded, her voice calm and steady despite the frantic beating of her own heart. We're going to the root cellar. It's safe there. She bundled him in a blanket and hurried him out the back door. From there, she could see the full horror of the situation. The grass fire was a monstrous, glowing beast, consuming the dry land at an incredible speed. And at the main barn, flashes of gunfire lit up the night. The rustlers were making their move. But as she was about to guide Samuel toward the heavy cellar doors, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just a diversion. A smaller, second fire had been set. A pile of oil-soaked rags had been thrown against the wall of the horse barn. One place Elias and his men were now defending from the front. The flames were already licking up the dry timber walls. It was a trap, designed to catch them between the thieves in the front and the fire in the back. There was no time to think. The men were too busy fighting to notice the new danger. Samuel, she said, kneeling to look him in the eye. I need you to be the bravest you've ever been. Go to the cellar and stay there until I come for you. Do you understand? He nodded, his small face pale but resolute. He trusted her completely. After watching him disappear into the safety of the earth, Eliza turned to face the fire. The well was too far. The horse trough. It was full. She grabbed 2 empty feed buckets and ran. The heat from the barn was already intense, the air thick with acrid smoke that stung her eyes and choked her lungs. She plunged the buckets into the trough, the weight of the water sloshing over the sides as she hauled them out. She became a machine, driven by pure adrenaline. She ran to the burning wall, threw the water at the base of the flames, and ran back for more. The fire hissed and steamed in defiance, but it retreated, just a little. Back and forth she went, a solitary figure battling an inferno. Her dress was soaked, her face black with soot, her arms screaming from the strain. From the front of the barn, Elias saw her. In a lull in the gunfire, he glanced back and saw the impossible sight of this woman, the woman he had bought for $100, single-handedly trying to save his ranch. His men were fighting for their wages. He was fighting for his legacy. She was fighting for their home. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. At that moment, one of the rustlers, seeing her efforts, broke away from the main fight and charged toward her on his horse. He was a large, brutish man, his face illuminated by the firelight into a demonic mask. He raised his pistol, aiming to put an end to her interference. Eliza saw him coming. She had nowhere to run. She stood her ground, a pathetic bucket in her hand, her heart seizing with terror. A single shot rang out, louder than the others. Not from the rustler's gun, but from the shadows near the house. The man grunted, his horse reared in panic, and he toppled from the saddle. Elias stood there, his rifle smoking, his face a terrifying mask of cold, protective fury. He had left the fight to save her. That single shot broke the rustlers' morale. Seeing their plan failing and their numbers dwindling, they retreated, melting back into the darkness from which they came, leaving behind the roaring grass fire and the smoldering barn. The immediate threat was over. Elias and his men, joined by Eliza, formed a bucket brigade and fought the barn fire until it was nothing but a smoking, blackened skeleton. They were exhausted, soot-stained, and battered, but they had won. As the false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Elias walked over to where Eliza was standing, her body trembling with exhaustion and reaction. He stopped in front of her. His face was streaked with soot, a cut was bleeding on his forehead, but his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray, soot-covered strand of hair from her face. His calloused fingers brushed her cheek. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. And in the way he said her name, with a reverence and awe that stole her breath, she knew that everything had changed. The fire had burned away more than just his barn. It had burned away the last vestiges of their old religion of master and servant, of owner and property. In the ashes, something new and infinitely more powerful was waiting to be born. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The great horse barn was a blackened, skeletal ruin, and a wide, scorched scar ran across the northern pastureland. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and defeat, but the house still stood. The horses were safe. They were all alive. The day passed in a weary, methodical haze of assessing damage and tending to wounds. Samuel, released from his cellar sanctuary, clung to Eliz's side, his earlier fear replaced by a quiet, solemn pride in the woman who had faced the flames. By evening, a profound exhaustion had settled over the ranch. After a simple, silent meal, Elias found Eliza by the creek that gave the ranch its name. She was sitting on a smooth, flat rock, soaking her feet in the cool, running water. A raw, red burn, a testament to her fight with the fire, marked her forearm. He approached quietly and sat on the grassy bank beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the gurgle of the water and the gentle sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods. The silence was not empty or strained, it was a shared space of recovery. "I went to town that day," Elias began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the water. "The day of the auction. I had no intention of buying anyone. I was just lost. I went to town for supplies, and it was like I was walking in a dream. Nothing felt real. Hasn't for a long time." Eliza listened, her heart still, knowing this was a dam that had been holding back years of pain. "When Maria died," he continued, his voice growing thick, "the light went out of this place. The house was just a collection of rooms. The land was just dirt. And my son." I looked at him and saw her, and the pain was so great I couldn't breathe. So I built a wall around myself. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I just kept moving, I could outrun the grief. But it was always there, waiting for me in the quiet of the house." He finally turned to look at her, his twilight eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "I saw you on that stage. You had the same look in your eyes, the look of someone who had lost their whole world. And in that moment, I did the most selfish thing I've ever done. I said to myself, here is someone who understands silence. Here is someone who won't fill the house with pointless chatter. She can just be there, and the house won't feel so empty." He shook his head, a look of self-loathing on his face. "I didn't buy a housekeeper, Eliza. I bought a ghost to share the house with my own. I brought you here to suffer quietly alongside me." The $100 was just an excuse. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, not of pity, but of a profound, aching understanding. "And then," he said, his voice softening, "you refused to be a ghost. You pulled weeds. You baked bread. You talked to my son when he was determined to hate you. You mended his knee. You stood up to me. You made things grow again. You fought for this place last night with a fierceness I've only ever seen in the wildest of creatures." He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "When I saw that rustler aiming his pistol at you, I realized something. If I lost you, it would be worse than losing the whole ranch. It would be like losing the light all over again." A sob escaped Eliz's throat. It was a release of all the fear, the loneliness, the humiliation she had endured. She had come to this place with nothing, a piece of property, and had found the one thing she never expected: a home. "You said my son awaited me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He did," Elias said, his grip on her hand tightening. "And so did I. We just didn't know it." He gently lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of profound respect and burgeoning love. The ghosts of the past were not gone. Maria would always be a part of this land, a part of Samuel and Elias. But now her memory was not a shrine to be mourned in, but a gentle story to be remembered. The house was no longer a museum of grief. It was a home, waiting for a new chapter to be written. And as Elias and Eliza sat by the creek, with the ashes of their past settling around them, they knew they would write it together. A year later, the scar on the land had begun to heal. New grass, vibrant and green, pushed its way through the blackened soil. A new barn, built with the help of neighbors who now saw Elias Thorne not as a reclusive rancher but as one of their own, stood proudly in the place of the old one. But the most profound change was in the small patch of earth behind the house. Eliza's garden had exploded into a riot of life and color. Rows of corn stood like tall soldiers, bean vines curled around their stakes, and fat, orange pumpkins rested in the shade of their own broad leaves. And towering over it all, a hedge of magnificent sunflowers turned their golden faces to the sun, symbols of a stubborn, beautiful resilience. The house, too, was transformed. The silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of life. Samuel's laughter echoed in the halls. The scent of baking bread and fresh-cut flowers filled the air. A colorful piece of Eliz's embroidery, a vibrant bird, finally finished, lay on the table next to Maria's old sewing basket. The two existed together, a testament to the past that had been honored and the future that had been bravely embraced. Eliza was no longer a servant, nor was she merely a companion. She was the heart of Black Creek. She rode beside Elias, her knowledge of the land and its needs as keen as his. She managed the household with a firm but gentle hand, earning the deep respect of the ranch hands who had once viewed her with suspicion. She was a mother to Samuel in every way that mattered, bandaging his scrapes, celebrating his triumphs, and tucking him into bed each night with a story and a kiss. One late summer evening, the three of them were in the garden as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Samuel was chasing fireflies, his small hands cupping the blinking lights before letting them go. Eliza stood by the sunflowers, tracing the rough texture of a leaf with her finger. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being so deeply rooted in a place that the wind could not possibly dislodge her. Elias came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their son, their future, dance in the twilight. "I think about that day in town sometimes," Elias said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "I paid $100 for you." Eliza leaned back against him and smiled. "It was the best bargain you ever made." "No," he said, turning her in his arms to face him. He looked into her eyes, the color of a calm sea now, and his own were filled with a love so deep and steady it was as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. "It wasn't a bargain. It was a miracle. I was a man drowning in the dark, and I didn't even know it until you walked into my life and lit a candle." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. "I love you, Eliza Thorne." He had asked her to marry him in the spring, a quiet, simple proposal by the creek, and she had accepted with a joy so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She was Eliza Thorne now, not by purchase, but by partnership, not by contract, but by love. "And I love you, Elias," she whispered. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that tasted of sunshine and wood smoke and the promise of 1,000 more sunsets just like this one. From the edge of the corn rows, Samuel called out, "Look, I caught a whole jar full." They broke apart, smiling, and turned to their son. He stood there, his face illuminated by the magical, pulsating glow of the fireflies in his jar, a boy who had found his laughter again. This was her life now, a life of hardship and beauty, of ashes and new growth. She had been the woman no one wanted, brought to this place in shame and desperation. But here, in the heart of the unforgiving West, surrounded by a man's quiet strength and a boy's bright future, under the watchful gaze of the sunflowers, she had finally, truly, found her home.